It was the kind of evening where the rain seemed endless, tapping against the windows like it had nowhere else to go. I arrived in the small city tired from hours of travel, my jacket damp from the drizzle. The guest house was tucked between two narrow streets, a quiet place my friend had recommended. When the door opened, she stood there with a polite smile that somehow felt warmer than the weather deserved. Her name was Hira, and she spoke with the calm tone of someone who had been expecting me, though we'd never met before. She offered tea before even showing me to the room, and the way she set the cup down made it feel less like a business transaction and more like a gesture from someone who cared if you were comfortable. The place was simple but clean, with a faint smell of wood polish and freshly cooked food drifting through the air. She mentioned the bedroom was ready, but also said there was a sofa in the living room if I preferred more space. Out of courtesy, I chose the sofa, telling her I didn't want to inconvenience her. She gave a small nod, though there was a hint of amusement in her eyes, as if she thought my choice was unnecessary. I set my bag down, opened my laptop, and tried to focus on catching up with work, but the quietness of the place and the occasional sound of her moving about in the kitchen kept pulling my attention away. We exchanged a few light comments over the evening. She teased me about tapping my pen while I typed, and I joked about her having a talent for making tea strong enough to wake the dead. The laughter was easy, unforced, the kind you don't expect with someone you've only just met. Outside, the rain kept falling, the streets empty and glistening under faint streetlights. It felt like we were tucked away from the rest of the world, strangers sharing a temporary roof. Later that night, after she'd finished locking up, she passed through the living room and saw me lying on the sofa, still awake and trying to get comfortable. She stopped for a moment, watching me shift and pull the blanket higher. Her voice was soft but certain when she said, "I won't let you sleep on the sofa. Get in bed." I looked up at her, caught between politeness and surprise, and replied with a half-smile, "The bed seems a bit small." The corners of her lips curved, not quite into a full laugh, but enough to carry the weight of an unspoken understanding. We let the moment pass without saying more, but it settled in my mind like a bookmark on a page I knew I'd come back to later. The next morning, the smell of something warm and familiar drifted through the air before I even opened my eyes. When I stepped into the small kitchen area, she was already setting down plates, the steam curling from fresh parathas and tea. She greeted me with a casual good morning, as if we'd been sharing breakfasts for years. We spoke about the weather first, the kind of safe conversation people lean on when they're still learning each other's boundaries, but before long we were trading bits of our lives. She listened without interrupting, her focus steady in a way that made my words feel like they mattered. As the day went on, I found myself helping her carry a few heavy supplies from a delivery truck. When she noticed me glancing at a crooked shelf in the corner, she handed me a screwdriver and said, "If you're going to stare at it, you might as well fix it." There was a rhythm to the day that came naturally. She moved through her tasks with quiet efficiency, and I found excuses to linger nearby. We weren't trying to impress each other. It was just comfortable, the kind of ease that doesn't happen often. By the third day, our conversations had shifted into more personal ground. She told me about growing up in the city, about the years she'd spent dreaming of leaving for somewhere bigger. But when her parents' health began to fail, she stayed, taking over the guest house to keep the family close. There was no bitterness in her voice, only a quiet acceptance. I told her about the constant moving in my job, the way hotels and rented flats started to feel like they all belonged to the same endless hallway. She smiled at that, saying maybe that's why I found her little guest house different. It wasn't trying to be perfect. One evening the power went out without warning. She lit a couple of candles and set them on the table by the window. The rain had returned, pattering softly against the glass. We sat there, not in a rush to fill the silence, until she asked what I would do if I could start over. The question caught me off guard, but I answered honestly. I'd slow down, travel less, maybe have a place where I didn't feel like a guest. She didn't say much in reply, just nodded, her expression somewhere between thoughtfulness and recognition. The more time we spent together, the more I caught myself hoping my work would take longer, that maybe I'd have another excuse to stay. It wasn't anything dramatic, No sudden declarations or sweeping gestures, just the steady pull of wanting to be around her. Every shared glance and easy laugh seemed to stitch the days together in a way that made leaving feel less like a plan and more like a mistake waiting to happen. The last week of my stay arrived faster than I expected, carrying with it a restlessness I couldn't quite shake. My work was wrapping up, the reason I'd come here nearly complete, but each time I thought about leaving, a quiet weight settled in my chest. I kept wondering if I should tell her what these days had started to mean to me. There was no guarantee she felt the same, and the fear of disturbing what we had made me hesitate. She seemed quieter too, her usual light remarks replaced by longer pauses, as if she also had something she wasn't saying. On my final evening, she told me she wanted to cook dinner for me before I left. I didn't argue, though the thought of it being our last meal together made me uneasy. When I returned from finishing my errands, the table was already set, the air rich with the smell of spices and fresh bread. We ate without rushing, speaking in fragments about safe topics. My train schedule, the weather for the next few days. Both of us steering away from the one subject hanging in the air. Afterward, I began packing my bag, folding clothes slowly, giving myself reasons to stay in the room a little longer. She stood by the doorway, leaning lightly against the frame, watching without a word. At one point she laughed softly and said, "Careful, or you'll forget something important." I smiled at her comment, but I knew she wasn't just talking about socks or shirts. There was a flicker in her expression, the kind of look you give when you're trying to memorize something for good. The next morning, she offered to walk with me to the station. The streets were still damp from the night's rain, the air holding that clean smell that comes after a storm. We talked about nothing in particular, our steps in quiet rhythm. At the platform, I set my bag down and turned to her, unsure how to end the moment. She stepped closer, wrapped her arms around me briefly, and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "Safe journey. You'll find bigger beds in bigger cities." I laughed because it was easier than admitting how much it hurt to hear. As the train pulled away, I looked back to see her standing where I'd left her, a still figure against the shifting crowd. I told myself I'd send a message once I arrived, maybe even plan another visit. But the hours turned into days, the days into weeks, and I didn't reach out. I convinced myself it was better to let it fade. Yet the quiet in my routine kept reminding me of what I'd left behind, and the more I tried to ignore it, the clearer it became that I hadn't just left a place. I'd walked away from a possibility. Months later, work brought me back to the same city. The thought of being there again stirred something I had pushed down, and without much planning, I decided I would go to the guest house first before anything else. I pictured her opening the door again, the same faint smile, the same warmth in her voice. But when I reached the street, the sign out front was different, and through the open door I could see strangers moving about. Inside, a middle-aged man greeted me politely. When I asked about Hira, he said the guest house had been sold to his family a few months earlier. She had moved away, and he didn't know where. There was no number, no address, nothing to follow. The words sank in slowly. I thanked him, stepped outside, and stood on the pavement while the city moved around me as if nothing had happened. I told myself she had probably gone somewhere better, somewhere she had once dreamed of. But the thought that I could have known, if I had only asked, if I had only spoken when I had the chance, kept circling in my head. I walked through familiar streets that now felt strangely empty, every corner reminding me of a conversation or a moment we had shared. That evening I checked into a hotel, the kind with crisp sheets and a bed large enough for 3 people. I lay there staring at the ceiling, thinking about that rainy night on the sofa. Her voice telling me to get in bed, the smile in her eyes when I said it seemed small. I realized it had never been about the size of the bed. It had been about the space she was offering, a place in her life for as long as I wanted it. I had taken it as a passing kindness instead of the invitation it really was. Regret isn't loud. It doesn't shout or demand attention. It sits quietly at the edge of your thoughts, waiting for the right silence to make itself known. I felt it now, heavy and unshakable. I took out my journal and wrote a single line. Some beds are small, but they fit 2 hearts. I just realized it too late. I closed the book and set it aside, knowing it wouldn't change anything, but needing to mark the thought somewhere. I don't know if I'll see her again, or if she even thinks of me now. Maybe she's building a new life, meeting people who don't hesitate to say what's in their hearts. But in the quiet moments, I still return to that small guest house, to the sound of rain on the windows, to the warmth of her presence. It's a memory I carry like a folded note in my pocket, unread by her but written all the same.